dumping the body of a trade unionist in a lonely spot. Trees crashing and logging, lorries idling. The quiet ooze of factory waste. Sewing machines humming, landmines clicking. Bombs bursting, earth shattering. Listen. Listen. Listen to the earth. Hear her weep. Listen. The Spirit gives us ears. Hear the voices. Hear the sounds. Campaigners shouting slogans. Protesters demonstrating. Workers negotiating. Governments conceding. People changing. Earth singing. Listen. Hear the Spirit's voice. Hear her sing. Life-giving Spirit, help us to treat the earth gently and each other justly. Bind us together to work for justice in the economy and on the earth. Seal us in a covenant that gives dignity to all women and men, young and old, black and white. Seal us in a covenant that anoints the wounded, humbles the proud, and resists evil without doing harm. Seal us in a covenant that cherishes the earth, challenges injustice, and promises life in fullness. Amen.
And with these moving words, we welcome you to this launch of the Decade for Climate Justice. My name is Hans Lessing. I'm serving as the Acting General Secretary of the World Communion of Reformed Churches, and I welcome you all to this launch. And I think the emphasis on listening that we have heard in this prayer and that we are reading in this beautiful piece from the book of Job, listen to the animals, listen to the plants, listen to the world around you, puts us in the center of what this Decade for Climate Justice is all about. Many people are dealing with the climate crisis already. And the question is, what is the focus of the churches? What is the focus of the World Communion of Reformed Churches? And the prayer that we have just heard is already pointing to important tenets that we receive from the Accra Confession that was adopted by the then World Alliance of Reformed Churches in 2004. The one is the justice for the economy and the earth. There can't be justice without taking the earth into consideration. And the second is that we are covenanting for justice in taking up, creating space for the voices of those who are marginalized. Human beings, creatures of nature, and the whole planet. And when we open our ears and listen, then we already feel so tangibly that the climate crisis isn't a theoretical issue, something that might happen in earlier or later decades to come. But if we listen, we hear that the climate crisis is a very tangible force in our world already, with droughts and floods, with famines, with people forced into internal and external migration and so on. So the crisis is already there. And everywhere on the world, we see systems, social systems, political systems, economic systems in stress. And this gives us a foretaste of how difficult this is all to become if things become even more harsh than they are now. already now we are hardly coping, and this will be a very, very big challenge for every person of goodwill, for every institution, for every church, for every Christian, for us as believers, that we believe that God has created this world and has said, and behold, it was all good. So therefore, we are not going on a leisure walk if we open this decade for climate justice, but I mean, we are preparing for a pilgrimage that will bring us to the places where people are already suffering, to listen to their hardship and to be inspired by their hope and by their mission to change the world, to make it a place where people, where creatures can live. And with this word, I would like to hand over to the moderator of the Decade for Climate Justice, that is Helen Jones from Cardiff. He is a professor for microbiology, very well articulate and well versed in the worlds of biological and environmental science, as well as in the world of the church, and someone with an open ear for creatures and human beings. Dear Helen, I'm happy to turn over to you, and I'm sure you will introduce the panelists and the program of this afternoon. Thank you very much for all of you. Thank you very much for all the people joining in from the different places to launch with us this very important campaign.
Great, thank you very much, and may I add my welcome to all of you as panelists and also as attendees to this webinar. Thank you, Sharon, for that very powerful prayer, and Hans for setting the scene so well for us. We are very fortunate in this webinar that we have 4 speakers, 4 very well-known speakers, 4 leaders in their field and in the field of climate justice. All 4 of them will approach the subject from a slightly different angle, and what I shall do is, as we move through the programme, I shall introduce each speaker in their turn. Let me start off with just a few short comments. Climate justice, the decade of climate justice. Climate justice is a concept that addresses the just division, fair sharing, and equitable distribution of the burdens of climate change and its mitigation and responsibilities to deal with those changes. It's been described as encompassing a set of rights and obligations which corporations, individuals, and governments have towards those who will be in many ways significantly disproportionately affected by climate change. It is interesting from our perspective that climate justice can be understood in many ways, and I've no doubt that some of those aspects will appear during the course of this webinar, and those different meanings can sometimes be contested. But at its simplest, conceptions of climate justice can be grouped along the lines of procedural justice, which emphasizes fair, transparent, and inclusive decision-making, and distributive justice, which places the emphasis on who bears the costs of both climate change and the actions needed and taken to address it. But I'm not the speaker today. There are 4 speakers who will delve into these particular areas. I'm just going to first of all ask Philip Peacock, one of the General Secretariat group within the World Communion of Reformed Churches, to introduce the whole concept of our decade for climate justice before I then move on and introduce our first expert. Philip, you are muted.
Thank you very much, friends. Thank you very much, Helen. In 2004, when the World Alliance of Reformed Churches came up with the Accra Confession, paragraph 8 of the Accra Confession said, the policy of unlimited growth among industrialized countries and the drive for profit of transnational corporations have plundered the earth and severely damaged the environment. In 1989, one species disappeared each day, and by 2000, it was one every hour. Climate change, the depletion of fish stocks, deforestation, soil erosion, and threats to fresh water are among the devastating consequences. Communities are disrupted, livelihoods are lost, coastal regions and Pacific islands are threatened with inundation and storms increase. High levels of radioactivity threaten health and ecology. Life forms and cultural knowledge are being patented for financial gain. And in 2004, in paragraph 9 of the Accra Confession, we said, this crisis is directly related to the development of neoliberal economic globalization, which is based on the following beliefs: unrestrained competition, the ownership of private property with no social obligation, capital speculation, liberalization, and deregulation of the market, and a loss of social obligations related to the protection of the poor and weak, the formation of trade unions, and relationships between people which were being lost. As the World Communion of Reformed Churches, we draw our strength and our faith imperative from, of course, Scripture, but also from the Accra Confession, which distilled these ideas for us within the context of the 21st century. Then, speaking with the rhetoric of covenanting for the earth and the economy, covenanting for justice in the economy and the earth, we name the integral connection between the economic system and the ecological crisis in which we live. Almost 20 years later, we find this crisis has got far worse, both in terms of economic inequality as well as ecological and environmental degradation. And we hold these two, the economic crisis and the ecological crisis, as being interlinked. We believe that the way to find alternatives to this is to learn from those who are oppressed, those who are marginalized. And we believe that we need to learn from the earth, which is itself marginalized within our present system. And so, in order to bring faith resources in which we can galvanize our communities, the ecumenical movement, and indeed the entire planet, we have launched a decade for climate change that we call Learning from the Earth, Witnessing to Climate Justice. And today we are here to launch this decade for climate justice. I will now turn over the session back to Helen and our wonderful panelists who will give us the theological, biblical, and other resources through which we can reflect on our present crisis and discover ways in which we can move forward within it.
Thank you very much, Philip, for that insightful background to what has brought us here. It is now my great pleasure, my great honor to introduce the first of our speakers, and that will be Helen Chukka. So Helen graduated with a PhD in Hebrew Bible, in the Hebrew Bible from the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago. Prior to her studies in the United States, she had worked for the National Council of Churches in India and worked there as the executive secretary for the Commission on Youth. Helen is an ordained pastor of the Andhra Evangelical Lutheran Church in India. Her interests include, but are definitely not limited to, Dalit women in India, intersections of caste and gender, anti-caste contributions in Indian films, feminist, womanist hermeneutics, and also post-colonial biblical interpretation. The way we are going to run this webinar is that the four speakers will present their thoughts, and then there will be a question and answer session afterwards. As the talks are being presented and as comments are being made, please feel free to add your comments to the Q&A on the webinar, and then I shall moderate a question and answer session at the end. But now I return to Helen Chukka and welcome her to the webinar to share her thoughts with us on biblical reflection.
Thank you, everyone, for this opportunity. On this World Environment Day, as WCRC launches its Decade for Climate Justice by focusing on learning from the earth, witnessing to climate justice, I title my biblical reflection as Earth and its Siblings as Episteme Communities. Earth and its siblings, which encompasses all living creatures, serve as storytelling communities filled with profound messages of deliverance. While often communities engaged in storytelling communicated stories from anthropocentric worldviews, in a world of rising temperatures, pollution, extinction of species, deforestation, sea ice loss, glacier melt, and extreme weather conditions, and many other things, it is crucial to deeply listen to the stories of the communities that are affected, in this case, the earth herself. The scripture portion, Job 12, 7-10, serve as an example of centering the voices of the marginalized storytellers who possess both profound wisdom and have experienced profound loss. Job 12, 7-10 reads, "Ask the beasts, and they will teach you. Also the birds of the air, and they will tell you. Speak to the earth, and they will teach you. And the fish of the sea will declare to you. Who among all these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this? In God's hand is the life of every living thing and the breath of every human being." The book of Job, one of the 3 books of wisdom literature in the Hebrew Bible, addresses a pertinent question that disrupts the traditional notion of wisdom rooted in the assumption that the righteous prosper and the wicked suffer. Departing from the other wisdom books such as Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, the book of Job, like the prophetic books, presents a prophetic voice that upholds the voices and stories of the marginalized. While the book of Job is often overlooked by many, it addresses important issues that are relevant for articulating theology by those at the margins. The book's emphasis on the Hebrew terms Evion, Dal, and Ani, which represent the powerless, the vulnerable, and the needy, appear multiple times throughout the book. The book focuses on the issues surrounding justice and its manifestations in the lives of the vulnerable communities, specifically in the life of Job. The book of Job presents Job as a representative of the oppressed and the powerless, who laments bitterly for his own pathetic condition. And in doing so, it offers a preferential option for the poor and the marginalized. It highlights the struggles and suffering of those on the margins, urging readers to recognize and respond to their plight. The text for today's reflection, Job 12, 7-10, should be read within the wider context of the accusations hurled by Job's friends against him. These friends present Job as the champion of justice, but wrongly ascribe Job's suffering to his own sinfulness and debauchery, engaging in victim blaming. In Job 11, 5-9, Jophar tells Job of the mystery of God's wisdom, which is higher than heaven, deeper than Sheol, longer than earth, and broader than sea. Responding to such presentation of God's wisdom, in chapter 12, 7-9, Job invites his friends who engage in blame game to listen deeply to others. In this case, to him and to the rest of the creation. He admonishes them of their biased knowledge systems that are self-centered, comparing his suffering, loss, sickness, and destruction with that of the earth's. He urges them to see beyond their prejudices and learn to ask the suffering ones, the beasts, and speak to the birds who will be willing to teach. The Hebrew term for teach comes from the lexical form yara, which means to direct, inform, instruct, show. In addition to appearing twice in today's text, it appears 9 other times in other biblical texts, but often with God as the subject of the verb. When Moses was called by God to lead the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt, and Moses expresses his insufficiency or unwillingness to lead the people because he is slow of speech and slow of tongue, God says in Exodus 4:12, "Now go, and I will be with you and teach you what you are to speak." Here, God is the subject of the term teach. Just like in this text and other texts that employ this term teach, the recipients of teaching or instruction needed additional support and guidance from the subject, that is, the earth and her siblings in this particular text, and God in other instances. If our knowledge systems are shaped by the dominant narratives that center human beings and their wisdom ways, it is crucial to be humble, to rely on the manifestations of God in the creation, and to receive the wisdom needed to participate in the liberation process, just as Moses did. Since Job's friends were interested in talking, condemning, blaming, and shaming, Job urges them to engage in asking, listening, and believing from those who are silenced. Job urges his friends and us to draw lessons from the suffering of those of both himself and the earth, using the creatures mentioned in the first creation story in Genesis 1 as instructors. By referencing the same categories of creatures, that is beast, sea, fish, from Genesis 1, Job emphasizes that these beings existed before humans and were originally deemed good by God, but are now experiencing pain and destruction. Job challenges his friends to be transformed by the earth and its siblings, which are the communities of knowledge where wisdom was inscribed during the creation of the cosmos. They are the ancient ones who possess valuable insights to be sought after. Job presents the beasts, birds, earth, fish, and sea as storytellers capable of speaking for themselves and sharing their stories, casting them as embodiments of wisdom. However, Job's friends' speeches indicate that they only perceive what aligns with their existing beliefs and dismiss or deny anything that challenges those beliefs, just like we all do in today's context. Their predetermined understanding of God, influenced by the prevailing notion of God's presence in high places, is disrupted by Job's insistence on recognizing the earth and its counterparts as the centers of knowledge. These creatures as narratives instill hope for the liberation of the entire creation. To echo Sinat's perspective, Job attests to this by speaking on behalf of the earth and making the focal point of his discourse, shifting the focus from the unknowable boundaries of God's knowledge to what is accessible and tangible. The passage today invites us to destabilize the myths about anthropocentrism in our theologies, ideologies, perceptions, and spiritualities, and summons us to be deep listening communities, especially to the marginal storytellers, and in this text, to the beasts, to the sky, the fish, and the sea. Job, along with the creatures, calls us to be listening community to those who are around us, even if they communicate it differently.
Thank you very much indeed, Helen. Much appreciate that. Some wonderful insights there into how we interpret, how we understand, and what messages we actually obtain from the scripture. And I encourage those of you attending, please submit any questions or comments or queries that you actually have on the Q&A facility. I now move on with great pleasure to introduce our second speaker. This is Jessica Bwali, who will talk in a slightly different direction and will actually look at the actioning of ecology and ecology thought, and will give it from a very youth perspective as well. So Jessica is, as many of you will know, is an award-winning, passionate Christian climate activist. She is a journalist, and also, which is where I had come across Jessica's name before, Tearfun's Global Campaigns Associate from Zambia. Jessica, under those umbrella tasks, as it were, or employment, has worked as a newscaster, a radio presenter, and a radio producer as well. Her climate campaigning work has taken her to COP26 and COP27. She was certified as a climate activist by the University of Oxford Climate Society, and she has been very much at the vanguard in raising her voice against climate crimes by documenting the effects of climate change on people in the front line. She has also witnessed firsthand devastating impacts of climate change on people in Zambia, and indeed on the continent as a whole around Africa. Jessica, it's wonderful to have you joining us today, and we very much look forward to hear your comments and insights. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heaven. Thank you for having me, and I'd like to say thanks to Reverend Helen for that really amazing biblical reflection that was so insightful. Thank you so much. So I will be speaking from a youth perspective on eco-activism. So if Philip could just help me, thank you. Okay, so thank you so much. I'll be talking on ecological activism, that's a youth imperative. And just like earlier, Philip mentioned that the theme we are having for a decade of climate justice is learning from the earth, witnessing to climate justice. And I'll be able to speak from my youth perspective, just see what young people can get to do when it comes to eco-activism, and also what young people would obviously love to get even in the midst of eco-activism. Next. Okay, so I'll just make it a little simpler. Ecological, also normally we call eco-activism, is just a way of engagement in campaigns. They could be social, they could be political, but they have an aim of preventing damages to the environment. I have added two photos, that's me in both photos. The first one is, it was Fridays for the Future protests in Germany, Karlsruhe, and there's one on the right, it was at COP26 in Glasgow. So the first one I was holding, when we look, this is actually a Bible scripture, and which says, God saw that it was good, now we are destroying it. Well, going down, that's us, we are destroying the earth. So when we say God saw that it was good, this is actually the scripture in the book of Genesis, that actually when God made everything, he saw that everything was so beautiful, the garden and everything that was put in it was so beautiful. And as human beings, we've been entrusted to be stewards of the earth. We've been entrusted to be steward of the garden, but we have conversation of climate change, climate crisis right now, all because there are certain activities that we are involving ourselves in, or there are certain things that we are doing that are destroying the garden. So instead of us living up to the standard of being good stewards of the garden, that is tendering to the garden, taking care of the garden, and ensuring that everyone is safe, both human and creatures, it's a different story now. Because of maybe our lifestyle, or just certain activities, greedy, selfishness, we are destroying the environment today, which is not what God expected us to do, because he actually put us in the garden as stewards, but we are doing the opposite. Then the second photo, I was carrying, the second photo I was carrying, this is actually a bill. On this one, it was a campaign on climate finance. So this is a time that we were trying to bring out the issues of how the countries on the front line are being affected by climate change, and also the fact that they don't really contribute so much to the carbon emission, yet they're in the front line of the effects of climate change. So this was a bill that it was actually a bill overdue to the countries that are high carbon emitters, that actually were supposed to own up to the promise that they gave of giving the $100 billion climate finance to the vulnerable countries. So when we talk about eco-activism, I put these two photos of me just as a sign. So this is going to the young people, this is going to the youths. These are some of the ways that you can actually involve yourselves when it comes to activism, for you to actually bring your voices out, for you to be heard, or for you to just put a say to a particular conversation. Now we're talking about climate justice. These are some of the ways that you can actually do. You can get involved in protests, as long as they're peaceful. You can get involved in protests, you can get involved in campaigns, in petitions, and so on. So these are the two photos I wanted to just kind of give a picture of what eco-activism is or can look like in a picture. If we go to the second one. When we talk about climate change, nowadays, I actually always, when we talk about climate change, I actually, most of the time, I get to avoid using the word change, simply because it's no longer a change, it's now a crisis. So when you use the word crisis, I think it emphasizes, it shows how real the change is. And when you talk about the impacts have actually intensified over the years. And we're looking at children and young people being the ones that are affected the worst. This photo that I have put here, I wanted to just give an illustration of how climate change can look in different places. So this is a place in Zambia. It's in the southern part of Zambia. So I'll just, for those of you that may be listening to me for the second or third time, the story I'm about to give, you may have heard me say this, because this is something that has been on my heart for a very long time. It's a story that has done, I think, a lot of contribution to my activism, because I want at some point got to be in contact with the person that is in the, I'm in a country that is in the front line of the climate of effects of climate, the effects of climate change. So I may understand when you talk about the different weather patterns, the drastic changes and so on, because my country is in the front line of the effects of climate change. So this photo, I took it when I was documenting the effects of climate change in Zambia. And this is a southern part of Zambia. It's a village in the southern part of Zambia. So it's just a quick one. When I went to this place, apparently this is supposed to be a river. When I was taken to this place, I was told it's actually a river, and I was told this river has claimed a lot of lives, because when it actually at its peak, a lot of people actually drown in it, as it is quite deep. I was told, if you look at the tree that is at the far end there, I was told when the river is at its peak, the leaves of the trees or the branches actually are submerged in water. So all this, where we're stepping, it was actually the bed of the river, which does not make sense, it being a river. So when we went there, it just looked like a dried up ditch. And when I was shooting my documentary, there was this elderly woman who should have been in her late 70s or early 80s, and she was drawing water. If you see, there's just some water up there. If you actually can see, there's just a little bit of water, and she was drawing water from there for drinking. And just by the side, there was a herd of cattle that was also coming towards the river to drink water. So you can see this picture of an elderly woman who's moved quite a distance to come to a dried up river to just come and draw water that is unsafe. This is a health hazard. I'm sure all of you can actually, agree with me. Come to a river that is dried up to just draw water that she can drink for that day. And it may look different in other countries, because maybe some people, this may even be news, because maybe for you, just into the kitchen, literally open tap water and drink, and it's safe, it's all right. But this is a different story when it comes to other people. They have to go, they face the effects firsthand of climate change. So I needed to show you this picture and just maybe give a little bit of concept around the picture to just really remind us of how climate crisis is real, and it is now. And when we look at the people that are actually affected the most, we are looking at children, we are looking at the young people, we are looking at the elderly, we're looking at women. So all these are classes of people that are affected, that are in the front line of the effects of climate change. So even as we are having any activities, whatever you're doing for that particular day, you should be able to remember that somewhere in the southern part of Zambia, there's a woman who has to drink water from a water source that looks like this on the screen, which is quite sad. We can go to the next page. So I'm talking about young people. I've deliberately put just one line of how young people are affected by climate, affected by climate change. I've put anxiety and stress. When we look at stress and anxiety, we are looking at a young person simply because you understand that it can rain tomorrow, it can flood, you can lose your family, you can lose your house, you may not go to school tomorrow. There's all this piled up anxiety that comes in place. There's all this piled up stress that comes in place. And also, I'm going to give an example of, there's a neighboring country from Zambia, it's called Malawi. It's just recent when there was a cyclone Freddy. I'm sure most of us may have maybe read somewhere what was happening. It was so devastating such that the effects are still, they may never recover. Definitely, because some people lost their loved ones and that you can't recover from that. Infrastructure, they can rebuild, but all these are things that young people would have to live with each day, because you don't know if the people that are in the decision-making seats are making the right decisions for everyone, for the benefit of everyone, for the benefit of tomorrow's future leaders. You don't have that clue, and yet you get to be filled up with so much anxiety, so much stress. And I deliberately put these two words to bring this close to home. I would have said a whole lot of technical things that are around the effects of climate change. But when we look at stress and anxiety, this is everybody's conversation. This is something that everyone can relate to, especially as young people, where you don't know if tomorrow it rains, the bridge gets washed away, if you're going to go to school. That is just the stress that all surrounds the effects of climate change. And when it comes to directly impacting the young people. If we could go to the next page, please. Next slide. So how can young people get involved in ecological activism? Okay, we've looked at how we are affected as young people, but we really cannot just sit as young people because we feel like we don't have the resources to do certain things, we don't have the power to make decisions and so on. There are certain things that as young people we have to do, and this is a have. Actually, you as a young person, there's something that you can do about maybe in trying to mitigate and adapt to the effects of climate change. First things first, you have to make your voice heard. So this, in as much as it's something that young people struggle with so much, by you involving yourself in protests, peaceful protest, I keep emphasizing, by you involving yourself in campaigns, by you signing up to certain petitions, you are making your voice heard. Because you should always remember to say, tomorrow, maybe the trees that you're seeing today may not be there simply because of the lifestyle that is today. Tomorrow, you may not have that water that is coming from that water source because maybe it will be dried up. Tomorrow, maybe the sunlight will be so hot such that it will actually be a health hazard on you. So as a young person, make sure that you make your voice heard. Get to speak in your churches, in your communities, in your schools. This is where these are spaces that as a young person you can express yourself fully. Does it mean you getting involved in educational programs? Get to do that. Are there radio programs? Get to be involved. Does it mean that you be involved in planting trees campaigns? Get to do that. And also when you talk about planting trees, let's not just end on planting a tree. Anyone can plant a tree, but the bigger picture is growing the tree. If you have planted a tree in your name, let that tree be, ensure that that tree grows until it actually shields or brings that shield that is needed in the environment. Are you promoting renewable energy? As a young person, are you standing against the fossil fuels that are all around? What are you suggesting as an alternative? In my country, Zambia, we're one of the countries that use clean energy. Actually, we use hydro for our power, though in as much as it is clean, it is it comes in place when the effects of climate change comes through. For example, this drought, then we risk actually having power cuts simply because maybe the machinery can't run when the water levels are low. And that is the story that most Zambians know about. So in as much as you may not change certain things, but you can put a word to promote the right thing. So if you want, clean, renewable energies to be promoted, get promoting, get to do that. If you want your country to adopt, energy saving practices, try and start talking. You can start as a person. You can join 2 people, 3 people, 4. It starts like that, but you need to start from somewhere. You need to put, you need to bring out your voices. Your voices should be heard in that area. Then applying your interest to the climate fight. I think this is something that as young people, we are so privileged to get to have. We are so talented. You have the technology around you. There's so much you can do with the technology. If you're an artist, why don't you compose songs that are actually championing climate justice? If you can write, why don't you write about that? If you can take nice photos, why don't you take photos that are depicting the crimes that people are committing against the climate and how they can be prevented? So all those, use your interest to actually fight for climate justice. If we're going to go to the next slide, please. So just before I get to this proverb, this is my presentation ends here. But before I get to this, as young people, I know there are a lot of things that we have to do, but also it goes both ways. If we are going to raise our voices, we need a platform to do that. If we are going to push for certain practices, there's a platform that has to be given. So I think for the people, the elderly people, the people in power, I think it's about time that you do not invite the young people to come on the decision-making tables, but allow the young people to sit at the decision-making tables. Because when you allow them, you are going to listen to what they are saying. You are going to listen to the ideas that they have. When you talk about the young people, there's 3 things that I know they have and in excess. They have energy, they have the time, and also they are exposed to the technology that they can use to the benefit of the whole environment. So if you can get these 3 very powerful things and combine, let's say, with the people that have the power, that is the people in power, the people that have money, and that is resources, and the people that are, have the knowledge, have the experience, these 2 generations can do so massively and can prevent and can protect the environment. But this discord that is there, where the young people are on their own, the elderly generation is on their own, it will be very difficult to actually fight the climate crimes. It will be very difficult. At the end of the day, it will seem like we are fighting 2 different crimes, yet we are trying to achieve one thing. So when young people are allowed on the table, let them bring the ideas that they have. The problem that we have is that young people will be invited to the table and they are told what to go and say out there. They are told what to go and do. But why don't you allow the young people come to the table and bring the ideas that they have? They may not be as polished, because we are learning as young people. They may not be as polished, or they may not be as maybe realistic at that time, but this is where your experience comes in as a person in power. This is where your experience comes in as a leader. This is where your experience comes in as an elderly person to say, this is a direction we can take. So if you combine these 2 generations, we can protect our environment. I wanted to end with this African proverb that says, many small people, if you can read it, many small people who in many small places do many small things can alter the face of the world. So there's the word small that keeps on being repeated. So this shows that it doesn't matter how small, how young you may feel, or maybe how not influential you may feel as a person, or maybe even the country that you are coming from, you may feel like maybe I'm from a certain part of the world, and if I say things may not be heard. Like I said, start alone, bring in the second person, bring in the third person, and start a movement. It starts from there. As long as you continue to do what you're doing, you continue to campaign for the right things, you continue to campaign and champion for climate justice. I think this is one of the ways that we can really put a mark as young people on the environment and also on this earth, realizing that we may not have what we are having. Maybe the species that we are seeing today, we may not have them tomorrow. So this is a call to the young people and also to the people in leadership, to the older generation, to say, let the two generations match and let us get to listen to each other and help each other in making sure that we champion climate justice. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for that. And I liked the challenges to both, as it were, the challenge to youth, but also the challenge to those of us who are slightly older, put it that way. I won't go into any discussion here, but your African proverb at the end there reminded me, I think it was Mother Teresa who reminded us that the ocean is made up of many drops, and we need to be a drop in that ocean. Thank you very much indeed. And we move on to our third speaker, and what a great collection of speakers we actually have. The next speaker is Eve Rebecca Parker from Manchester. Eve is a lecturer in modern theology at the Department of Religion and Theology at Manchester University, having previously worked at Durham University, where she researched the barriers to belonging in theological education, focusing on inclusive and transformative pedagogy. Now, the outcome of that particular research was published in her latest book, Trust in Theological Education, Deconstructing Trustworthiness for a Pedagogy of Liberation. Eve's other research areas include feminist and liberation theologies and world Christianity. For her doctorate, for her PhD research at the University of St. Andrews, she engaged in ethnographic research in the context of South India with Dalit women dedicated to local village goddesses, such as the Devadasis. And this led to the publication of her book, Theologizing with the Sacred Prostitutes of South India Towards an Indecent Dalit Theology. She is also currently researching abuse in religious context. Very privileged to welcome you to our panel, Eve.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the amazing speakers so far. The climate crisis is the most existential threat facing our planet today, and it is profoundly and deeply rooted in neoliberal capitalism. It is not an accident, but it is a consequence of humanity's failure to hear the groans of creation amidst the desire for more control and consumption of earthly resources. It's a crisis of abuse, not just of the land, but of workers, of children, and of indigenous communities. It's also an outcome of religious abuse that the Christian church has been complicit in, where centuries of dominant discourses of anthropocentric theologies have enabled a church that for too long remained impotent in the face of capitalist means of production and proclaimed human notions of superiority over the rest of creation. It's the lasting shadow of empires of past and colonialism of the present that privileges the wealth of the few over the needs of the many. As such, we have to ask ourselves, as individuals as well as collectives, what our role is in demanding climate change justice. When, to quote Psalm 11, the foundations are destroyed, so what can the righteous do? Because right now, governments around the world are failing to act. Profit is persistently put before people and before land, and no one with any sort of insight can honestly look into the world today and fail to see that something is radically wrong. So how then do we theologically respond to such structural and systemic violence that unashamedly and disproportionately affects the most economically vulnerable? I want to suggest that what is needed is a politically charged theological response of anger, and lament. Because how often we hear our churches and leaders talk of theology of love for the poor, taking the side of the poor, walking with the marginalized. But what does it mean to do a theology of or from the margins if it is not angry? Angry at the lack of workers' rights, the polluting of waters, and the sinking of lands. If it is not disgusted at the fact that the richest 1% grabbed nearly 2/3 of all new wealth during the pandemic, whilst the poorest became poorer, and that 1/3 of all freshwater mollusks, 1/3 of sharks and rays, 1/4 of all mammals, 1/5 of all reptiles, and 1/6 of all birds are headed toward oblivion. What good is a theology of love if it is not turning over the tables of the elites, helping to unionize the workers, and demanding political change to bring an end to the climate crisis? And if it is not outraged at the mass extinction of species in the Anthropocene? Such love is weak and self-serving if it is not angry and rooted in economic justice, climate justice, environmental justice, and social justice. So when we talk about changes in the weather, forest fires, rising sea levels, let us give these facts faces. The faces of the millions of children dying every day so that the phones we carry in our hands, our laptops, and our cars can have the cobalt they need for the lithium-ion rechargeable battery that they rely on. And for that battery, for that smartphone, for that laptop that we type on, children in the southeastern provinces of the DRC are forced to inhale lethal mineral dust that also contaminates the water and the earth as they and their families mine for cobalt in order to earn a tiny amount of money to eat, whilst the multinational corporations exploit both them and the earth, earning trillions, manipulating the masses to think that they need these later consumer trends. But at what cost? The cost is child labor, it's toxic waste, it's land destruction, and it's contaminated waters. So when we talk about consciousness in the climate crisis, we're also talking about class consciousness, because it's about acknowledging that this is an economic battle. It's a racial battle. It is a social battle. It is a gendered battle that is destroying the world. So it's got to take more than collective statements, than letters to political leaders, than wishy-washy theologies, and I include myself in that. Because whilst this might make us feel better that we've done our bit in addressing the crisis, such actions are self-serving if they do not lead to affirmative action, to policy, to praxis, to workers' rights, to political change. And this is important because as we look at the interconnected struggles amongst Earth inhabitants in the fight for survival, we've also got to recognize that the battle is not lost, because the landless, the exploited, the women, the poor, the climate refugees, the workers demanding safe working conditions, the families going hungry, the ones saying enough is enough, we are the majority. They are the 2%. And in numbers, there is strength. In solidarity, there is hope. And with the God who created the word made flesh, there is resistance, resilience, and the power of that same word who was crucified. But did he too not rise up? In the resurrection and the ascension of Jesus Christ, it is written that life conquered death, that redemption from even the most painful of human destructiveness is not only possible, but promised. And no, this is not treading down the path of a blissful triumphalism theology that says, don't worry about the struggles of the day, because the hope is in the kingdom to come. It's about acknowledging the need to be angry and lament at the realities of the climate crisis. Because as Christians, we're taught to lament the injustices on the earth, just as the biblical laments do, to name what is wrong, name the evils and resist the evils. And in doing so, express, yes, eschatological hope, but by bearing witness to what should not be, and therefore to what should be and what will be according to God's promises. However, as Christians, we can be often so quick to jump to hope, and we often don't think to begin with lament or root our mission in lament and anger. Anger in the face of the climate crisis and the murdering of children for phones. We're perhaps too quick to jump to joy. The joy of the resurrection and the hope of the kingdom, though, can come at the expense of lament and the suffering of the crucifixion. The lament and anger, or the loss of lament and anger in our churches, I think is a problem of Western society, that the pathos of our condition is not that we've simply failed, but the pathos of it is that we cannot bring ourselves as a people to contemplate our failure. If lament and anger expresses our agonized awareness that this world desperately needs transformation and that we still await God's will to be done on earth as it is in heaven, then the loss of lament signals a loss of passion for social justice, and ultimately a failure to wrestle with God in pain, mourning, and protest about the grief and violence on earth. So where the indecency of lament and anger is removed from the missions of the church then fails to confront oppression. As such, anger presents us with a way of knowing that is unique. It is the cries of the oppressed that call on us to participate in a revolution, to resist the systems that subjugate. So lament and anger are political. It's about taking sides. It's about responding to the epistemological silencing of the tears of the downtrodden and the injustices to the earth. Yet, as Christians, we are often so quick to move from anger to hope and joy. Joy in the promise of a kingdom to come, but such joy is such a strange thing. Sometimes it can be used to sedate the truth of hopelessness and suffering, and therefore to mask the oppression in the here and now. It can then save us from our responsibility in thinking about how the narratives of struggle and oppression have something to do with us, especially if it's a joy that does not sing out the struggles of resistance. It can stop us from asking critical questions about our own role in such stories of struggle. So to speak of the joyful hope in the resurrection of Christ in light of such grave suffering apparent in the climate crisis is to do a grave disservice to the cross of Christ and the ambiguity of hope in the midst of such violence. We cannot then let the promise of joy be a gateway to indifference, as our missional efforts must overcome the lack of consciousness and solidarity in the world today. So consequently, I do not think we can or should ignore the fact that certain strands of Christianity have allied themselves with climate change denial. Often such strands are deeply rooted in politics of exclusivism and hate, happily clapping to joyful Christian songs whilst attempting to silence the calls for climate justice, calling it maybe woke or lefty politics. But just as woke means to be awoken to the realities of oppression around us, this is a time that humans need to be asking the question, what exactly does it mean to be human? Particularly when we are so quick to dehumanize in the face of technological advances and the expansion, for example, of artificial intelligence. It's a really critical time right now to ask this deeply and profoundly theological question. What does it mean to be human in this catastrophic climate crisis? One of our biggest weapons in the face of climate change denial or indifference to the climate crisis can be our theology, because the Bible of the persecuted masses is one of the greatest weapons of the poor in the battle cries for justice. And so we must not let those who seek to use Christianity as a means of silencing the climate crisis to take control of the Bible. Because this is the manifesto of the poor, where it is written that the Lord's anger is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. So whose truth and what truth must we speak of? It is here that the truth of the land, the seas, the dying species must be spoken. And our mission, if not rooted in resistance to the silencing of such truths, is simply docile, joyful Christian banter that maintains oppression and nullifies the need to act. We must not domesticate suffering and struggle. I'll end quickly soon, but I was speaking to a good friend of mine recently, who's a survivor of the genocide in Rwanda. And he said to me that after you witness the horrors of genocide, the massacre of 1 million people in 3 months, mass rape, looting, and slaughter, that you no longer fear death. That you no longer fear death. In fact, you just hope for a quick death because you become so resigned to the struggle that you're already dead. There are atrocities that humanity has committed against one another that are almost too painful, too unthinkable and disturbing to talk about, particularly as we think about contemplating God and the mission of the church in the face of the climate crisis. And yet it was inside a church building that more than 1,000 Tutsis were rounded up in the province of Kabongo, Rwanda, and massacred. It was in this church building that hundreds of bodies of women and children, had been left where they were, tangled skeletons in places of worship, where priests turned on priests with machetes and guns. We can't ignore tangled skeletons in churches, murdered bodies in gas chambers, the corpses of indigenous children under mission schools, the annihilations of entire species, the wiping out of indigenous communities, the polluting of water, the violence committed daily against women and people of colour. These are narratives of silence, lament that I believe must shape the future of the mission of the church. And the church itself has been complicit in such silencing. So in other words, we can't jump to the resurrection of Christ. We've got to dwell in the struggle of the cross and ask ourselves, what do the tortured bodies of genocide teach us about God? What does it mean to be human in the midst of the climate crisis? And what will it mean for humanity as humanity tries to play God with artificial intelligence? Will we end up by wiping out humanity entirely as a direct consequence of our own egotism and false notions of superiority and supremacy? Yes, a sense of hopelessness grips the soul, but we can't respond with simplistic solutions, grounded in a fragile, superficial joy. So I pray that we move away from language of theologies of the margins to theologies of the masses that speak for the many, not the few. And by that, I mean the collective many, who each carry their own struggles, narratives, witness, and testimonies, but know that in solidarity and righteous anger, the collective can bring about change. I pray that we become a thorn in the backsides of the multinational corporations, not some Christian communities of bygone eras of the past that no one notices, but mass movements of resistance that are angry at children dying for cobalt, species becoming extinct, waters becoming polluted, and workers not having rights. Good-mannered Christianity is a Victorian imperial notion that promotes passive acceptance of colonialism, making the people docile with theologies that speak of human supremacy, whiteness, and joy in the midst of suffering. Such Christianity won't help in the face of the climate crisis. It is an enabler. Now is the time for the ill-mannered Christians to lament, to refuse to stay silent, to be angry, and as the psalm says, "O Lord, you will protect us. You will guard us from this generation forever." On every side, the wicked prowl, as vileness is exalted among humankind, so let us resist them as a collective of the angry masses who say enough is enough. I'll end there.
Thank you, Eve. That was a very powerful and heart-piercing set of comments in many ways. I think what I shall remember for that, for some reason, it really made an impact on me. We cannot let the gateway of joy lead us to the avenue of indifference, and that really has had quite a major impact on me as I was listening. Which takes us to our final speaker on the panel, who will talk on towards a just eco-spirituality. This is Jessica Hetherington, who is an ordained minister in the United Church in Canada. Jessica has a PhD in eco-theology, having written a dissertation that was entitled Ecological Praxis as Discipleship, Developing a Model of Praxis from Sally McFaig's Theological Call for Consumption Reduction. Her two identities as an eco-theologian and an ordained minister, they so much intertwine in her work with individuals and communities of faith in learning around the ecological crisis, the role of faith, and the potential for Christian discipleship as a way to radically and faithfully respond to the demands of the ecological crisis. Jessica, it's a great privilege to welcome you to the panel.
Thank you so much, Helen, and thank you to everyone for this stimulating webinar. As we move into this decade for climate justice, we are recognizing that the climate crisis has become the defining issue of our time. It is an existential emergency that brings every other issue facing humanity and the entire Earth community into its fold. There is no other justice issue, no other humanitarian issue that isn't affected and compounded by the climate emergency. Further, we recognize that the climate emergency now affects every single area and aspect of the Earth. There is nowhere that the climate crisis is not. Finally, we recognize that the climate emergency is the emergency that threatens to end us as a species, to cause the extinction of human beings without immediate and radical changes to the ways in which we do nearly everything. How we get the energy we need for heating and cooling, building and growing food, and so much more. Many in the world need to consume less, much less than we already do. And so many need to consume more in order to be able to live safe, fulsome lives in community with others. And we need to change the ways in which we relate to both human and the more than human beings with whom we live in remarkably complex ecosystems within the Earth community. With all of this, then, we recognize as people of faith that our spiritualities, the ways in which we seek to walk with God and with others, the ways in which we seek to be whole human beings in a world imbued with the presence of God, are or should be intricately connected to the quest for climate justice, a climate justice for all of the Earth community. Scholar of Christian spirituality, Michael Downey, offers us a reminder of what it means to live a deeply spiritual life. He says that in order to do so, one must cultivate an abiding awareness of levels of reality beyond the self, which are not immediately apparent. This is a helpful definition to keep in mind when we reflect on what has been a pernicious root of the ecological crisis, and especially the climate emergency. It is helpful because in talking about awareness of the levels of reality, we are able to reflect upon the worldview that has played such a central role in getting us into the mess we are in right now with respect to the climate crisis. Worldview is how we attempt to name and frame our reality. Worldview is how we ask and answer the questions of who we are, what the world is, where we have come from, and where we are going. The role of worldview is considered by many eco-theologians, such as myself, to be central to the problem of the ecological crisis. This is because worldview actually informs the actions that we take in the world, how we move through the world. They impact the choices we make collectively on how to live together, how to function. And they impact, among many other things, our spiritualities. How we understand who we are, how we define the world and what it means, and how we comprehend where we come from and imagine where we are going. All of this informs and shapes our actions in the world and shapes the way we seek to be whole human beings in a world of mystery. The dominant worldview today, however, that is at the root of dominant interpretations within Christianity is a disordered one, wherein we see humans as divorced from and superior to the rest of the natural world. This is the mainstream worldview that has functioned and is continuing to function throughout the world, and is foundational to the history of colonization, white supremacy, misogyny, as well as attitudes toward the natural world. Such an understanding was developed from the sciences of René Descartes, Francis Bacon, Isaac Newton, and others, from whom Christian scholars and other thinkers in the global north inherited an understanding of knowledge and progress as a linear trajectory forward, and the isolation of fields of study from one another. It was all based on the idea that the physical world is devoid of meaning and is there to be conquered and mastered by human beings. Progress is measured, among other things, by how thoroughly we are able to conquer and master the material world around us. This has had devastating repercussions for the natural world, as we know by now. This approach has led to a dominant worldview of radical discontinuity from the rest of the natural world, where humans see ourselves as somehow separate from the life systems of the planet, with all rights given to ourselves. The problem with this kind of worldview is that it affects how we feel about ourselves, others, and God, and directly impacts how we act in the world. It affects, among other things, our spirituality, how we walk with God and others in the world in the search for integration of self, God, and other. What this means then, among other things, is that if we are to effectively respond to the ecological crisis and most urgently the climate emergency, then we must address the problem of this disordered worldview. And if we are to seek a just eco-spirituality, as I've been asked to address today, this is particularly necessary. For decades now, eco-theologians have been looking for an alternative framework that can reorient human beings in relation to the natural world with a more constructive ecological worldview, something that can reshape our beliefs and actions to be harmonious with all of creation and healing of ecological devastation. To be sure, such an ecological worldview has existed for many generations within the Earth community, particularly within Indigenous communities across the globe. It has also existed in earlier forms of Christian spirituality. However, it has been the dominant worldview that has developed out of a particular stream of Euro-Western Christian thought and philosophy that has brought us to this place where it is now or never with respect to climate justice. One scholar who sought to develop an ecological worldview that could function to ground an earth-healing spirituality was Thomas Berry, a priest and cultural historian who called himself a geologian, a theologian of the earth. In his work, he called for a new cosmology rooted in the understanding of the 13.8 billion year emergent universe. He presents a richly layered understanding of humanity and our place in the universe, and the central importance of worldview to our being and acting on the earth. His is a deeply rich, complex theology. Its bottom line is that all human ways of understanding must be reoriented within the observable order of things. For Berry and others with him, Christianity and the entire Euro-Western religious spiritual tradition needs to renew itself in relation to the ways that the ecosystems of the planet Earth function. In other words, it is about a reshaping of religious traditions in light of what we know about the functioning of the earth and the scope and reach of the ecological crisis, rather than trying to understand those things within the constructs of religion, which is what we have been doing for thousands of years. This is a radical shift in perspective. It is out of a rich worldview like this, a new cosmology, that Christians can reflect upon the integrity of the earth's ecosystems and the place of the human as a species within them, and so begin to develop a Christian way of looking at things. As people of faith, as Christians seeking to work for climate justice and to restore our place in the earth community in ways that are healing, not harming, we need this kind of ecological worldview. We need it desperately, because the current worldview, the one of radical discontinuity from the rest of the natural world, where humans see ourselves as somehow separate from the life systems of the planet, with all rights given to ourselves, has been utterly devastating for the natural world, not to mention the masses, as Dr. Parker was talking about. It has been devastating for our spiritualities and for our spiritual traditions within the church. When we see ourselves as separate from and superior to the natural world around us, then we deny the scientific reality of evolution and the ways that human beings have emerged into an incredibly complex, interconnected, and interdependent web of all that exists. Further, we then deny that God created all of creation, all of it, through the engine of evolution, and as we affirmed in our first creation story, that God called it good. When we deny these two truths, the truth of science and the truth of God as creator of all, then returning to Dr. Downey's definition of spirituality, we are unaware of levels of reality beyond the self which are not immediately apparent. If we, as people of faith, as Christians, seek climate justice in this world, in God's good creation, then we need to develop an eco-spirituality that reflects what we now know about the Earth community. We need to develop an eco-spirituality that seeks to become ever more aware of the ways in which we are in community with all of life and what sustains it here on Earth. We need to become ever more aware of the harms that we have caused to the Earth, especially through the climate crisis, and be able to listen to the cries of the Earth community, both human and more than human. And we need to move toward a just eco-spirituality that can ground us in God, help us hear God's call of discipleship on our lives, and spur us to action so that we can use all of our time, talents, and treasures toward the radical and transformative climate justice that we need now, today. Let us all, each one of us in community, move forward in faith, in truth, and in justice on this eco-spiritual path. May it be so. Thanks be to God.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Thank you so much for that. As someone from Wales, I had remnants of Celtic spiritualism or spirituality coming into that sort of discourse that you had. I have 7 minutes left, dear panel, and there are some questions that have been submitted. What I will do is I will try, and there are 3 main themes here, and I shall try and touch on all 3 themes so that all the attendees feel that they've been addressed. Possibly in your responses, if you could be relatively short, that would be, and brief, that would be excellent. To start off with, Jessica, since we were talking about spiritualities there is a question directed towards what you were saying. How far is indigenous spiritualities to be incorporated in the context of decolonizing eco-theology today? That's quite a large question. I'm not sure how easy it is to answer briefly, but I'll give you a time to do so.
Well, it's always challenging when you give a preacher a question, but I will endeavor to be short. That's an excellent question that I have been asked numerous times, and I am a Canadian settler living on unceded and unsurrendered First Nations Algonquin territory in Canada. And one of the things that I feel is really important for myself as a settler and for all of us to be aware of is the importance of not appropriating theologies and spiritualities that are not from our own tradition, but to be intentional. And I feel like this is, I'm so careful with this language. It's not about creating or allowing space, but being aware of there also being space for Indigenous leadership and Indigenous voices to add to the conversation. Many times I've been asked about whether I'm talking about Indigenous spirituality or whether that's what's informed me. And I say, as a settler Christian in Canada with our own particular history of attempted genocide of Indigenous peoples here, no, I'm talking out of my own Christian tradition that is not Indigenous. But there are so many Indigenous voices within the Christian church and in other spiritualities, and we need all of them at the table. And I certainly think we have to recognize that Indigenous leaders around the world have been at the forefront of the climate fight. And so also to recognize that need to really sort of step back and not, I don't want to reinscribe that Euro-Western dominant voice onto, just because now I'm talking on the right side of history, I hope, right? So that's that piece around making sure we bring all the voices together and we don't appropriate voices that are not our own.
Thank you very much. It's a topic that we could continue discussing for a long time. Jessica, only because it actually is directed towards being active and taking active, there are a couple of comments here expressing some concern that possibly those who are disabled in numerous ways are possibly discriminated against when it comes to eco-activism. I don't know whether you have some views on that.
Yes, Helen, thank you so much. I think that is a very sensitive and really important actually question that has come through, because people that the differently abled people, they are one of the people that are actually affected the most with the effects of climate change. For example, if there's displacement, you find that a person that is a disabled person will have issues to move. And also when it comes to maybe ensuring to go and get some clean water and so on, it's like twice it's twice the pain or twice the effort that will be the person with disability has to give in order to actually, get around the effects of climate change. So it's very important due to that, because of that, it's very important that they are considered, because it's true, to some extent, I really agree with that comment, because you find that even when you're having protests, you find that have you considered a person that is on a wheelchair that would want to be a part of the protest? Have you considered if they can be given that space to move with you? Have you considered certain certain let me say rules or I should say regulations that actually are in line, give them that space to be able to bring forth the ideas. So I think to start with, we need to give a space, we need to be in a space that the disabled, they are able to be a part of, regulating policies when it comes to climate justice. You don't make a decision on behalf of a particular group of people when you don't understand how they are affected. So if they are brought into the space of actually, given the space of also making inputs in decisions, it starts from there. Then we can actually be in a good space. All of us, we can fight together without discrimination and so on. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much. And then even Helen, possibly a comment more than a question, but it'd be great to hear your views on that. We've heard mention today of Earth and its siblings. We've heard mention of stewardships. There's a comment here about we needing to involve Earth as a comrade in arms against the superpowers when it comes to ecological action. And I'm thinking of, we've heard talk in environmental ethics of dominator, steward, and partner, participant. I'm just wondering what your views are, both of you, on involving Earth and its siblings, as it were. St. Francis of Assisi there, the brothers and sisters, the plants and the animals, as it were. Eve, possibly first?
Yeah, sorry. I think Hans started by saying that we've got to listen to each other and to the earth. And I remember reading quite recently about how blue whales have changed how they sing recently, the tone in which they sing and how loudly they sing, as a result of having to respond to the melting of icebergs and being able to be heard over that noise. And that goes at the heart of what our theology should be doing and our praxis and policy should be doing. We need to listen to the whales' change of tone, the whales' change of song, and hear that. That's a song of protest. So it's not that nature, the animals aren't speaking out. In fact, they're crying out and we're just choosing not to listen.
Thank you. And Helen?
In continuation to what Dr. Parker said, I think when we talk about Earth and siblings, it's also, I think, important to understand the different ways they communicate, because each one of us talk differently. And if we want the Earth to talk the same way that we want to listen, then I don't think there's going to be ever a conversation or a listening session can ever happen. And so I think we need to develop those mechanisms to listen the way it is communicated, instead of listen from an expectation that this is how it has to be communicated. So yeah.
Great, thank you ever so much. And I wish we could continue with the discussion. Some very valid points have been made on the Q&A. Before I hand over to Philip to bring the webinar to an end, can I just take the opportunity to thank you for, as panelists, you've made my life as a moderator incredibly easy. Thank you ever so much, Jessica Hetherington, Eve Rebecca Parker, Helen Chukka and Jessica Bwali. Thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for some incredible contributions. I really have appreciated it. Philip.
Thank you very much, Helen. Brothers and sisters in Christ, thank you very much for attending this webinar, for being with us today. A big thank you to our panelists and to Helen. We will have more webinars on this topic. We hope to engage with you in the decade. And thank you very much for being here today. And shall we bring the session to a close with prayer? May it come soon to the hungry, to the weeping, to those who have thirsted for your justice, to those who have waited centuries for a just life. Grant us the patience to smooth the way on which your kingdom comes to us. Grant us hope that we may not be weary in proclaiming and working for it. Despite so many conflicts, threats, and shortcomings, grant us a clear vision that in this hour of our history, we may see the horizon and know the way on which your kingdom comes to us. Amen. And thank you, everyone. Thank you.